Westchester Alliance for Sustainable Solutions is an alliance of community organizations from across Westchester County working to close the Wheelabrator Westchester trash incinerator in my city of Peekskill, where the county's trash is burned. So our agenda for tonight is the welcome, which we're doing now. And then I'd like to share a few updates on the work we've all been doing. Then we will welcome our expert speakers for tonight. So we have Patti Wood from Grassroots Environmental Education, and she'll be giving us the basics of PFAS. And you might be wondering what it stands for. She'll cover all of that. And then we have Professor David Bond joining us to talk about how airborne PFAS contamination becomes soil and water contamination. And as usual, we're going to have action items that we will take this evening to further our goals of basically moving to a more just and sustainable waste management system. So the main update that I have for you, and I'll go into more detail later in our action items, are that our last year's goal was to get Westchester County to issue an RFP to retain a certified zero waste consultant to create a roadmap to get Westchester County off of trash incineration and implement zero waste solutions so that we would shut down this trash incinerator and not need it anymore. The RFP finally came out at the end, or just recently, maybe the end of February, which is good news. The less good news is that it wasn't as stringent and as forceful as we wanted it to be in terms of how they define zero waste, or the requirement for a certified zero waste consultant. So our action item, one of our action items for tonight, is going to be to reach out to the county executive, reiterate what we need this $90,000 to be spent on, and keep the pressure on him and make sure he knows, like, we're paying attention and we want the most bang for our buck. And that means certified zero waste consultant using the peer-reviewed definition of zero waste, not an industry association's definition, things like that. So that is our big update for tonight. Ellen, do you know, has Patti joined yet? Or Caitlin?
Yeah. I don't think so, Courtney. I'm going to look one more time.
Okay. And we're recording, right? Okay. So tonight we're covering PFAS, which is, a lot of us know it as a forever chemical because it doesn't go away. You might be wondering, why are we talking about PFAS in relation to trash incineration? So you might have seen some of these numbers before. This is the data from the 2017 emissions report that Wheelabrator filed with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And you can see some of the nasty stuff that is on there: the lead and mercury, benzene, nitrogen oxides. You don't see PFAS. And that is because you only find what you look for. And right now, the EPA doesn't require looking for PFAS. And so there is, like, these are just the things that the DEC and the EPA require Wheelabrator to test for. That means there's a lot of other stuff that that regulators have blinders on. And we need to remember that just because these are legal limits and they're not exceeding the legal limit of these air pollutants, doesn't mean these limits are safe, right? So we need to keep that in mind, and keep in mind that they're not testing for everything. They're not doing a comprehensive look at everything that is being emitted. They're just looking at this small list. The other thing to keep in mind is, where does everything go, right? So the picture from here, this is that first plume of smoke. That is from the trash incinerator in the background there. But it doesn't just go into the air, right? A third of whatever is burned, that weight is turned into toxic ash. So concentrate all the worst of what's in your garbage, and that is what is left over. And this image on the right is the Frit Pit in Cortland, which is a mountain of millions of tons of this toxic ash. And it is called Sprout Brook Park because it is along the brook that feeds into Peekskill's watershed. So they capped that after it got full, and now they send it to another community, Putnam, Connecticut, that doesn't want it. They also don't have to test everything that is in the ash. So another potential source of these pollutants. And just a quick reminder of what we're throwing away. So this is from the DEC as well. And you can see that big gray piece that is plastics, right? So a lot of plastics generate a lot of awful contaminants. And then that's airborne, it's in the ash. So these are why we are covering this here tonight. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to, I saw Patti hop on from the waiting room. So Patti, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to read like just 2 sentences bio for everyone, and then allow Patti to speak, and she can cover more of her expertise relevant tonight if she so wishes, or she can jump right in. So Patti Wood is the founder and executive director of Grassroots Environmental Education, an award-winning not-for-profit environmental health organization whose mission is to inform the public about the health risks of common environmental exposures and to empower individuals to act as catalysts for change in their own community. And she certainly catalyzed some of my actions. So thank you, Patti. She's also a visiting scholar at Adelphi University, where she lectures on the environment and human health at the College of Nursing and Public Health. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and turn it over to Patti Wood. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
You're so welcome. I'm sorry I was late, but you know what? This is how it goes in life, right? I was intending to be here by 7, but our GPS said 7:38. Can't do any better. So anyway, thank you so much for your interest, first of all, in this really critical environmental health issue, and for inviting me to share some background information on PFAS. So PFAS is a class of highly toxic chemicals, currently consisting of approximately 15,000 different chemicals. They contain unbreakable carbon and fluorine bonds, which is one of the strongest man-made bonds that exist in chemistry. And with no natural way, for instance, through sunlight, where some of our other toxic chemicals, in fact, our persistent toxic chemicals, can actually break down, even though slowly, these chemicals are called forever chemicals because they do not break down. PFAS has heat-proof, waterproof, grease and stain-proof, and non-stick properties. These are really valuable properties, making them one of the most useful class of chemicals. The first PFAS was synthesized in the 1930s by IG Farben, which was a chemical company in Germany, which we know very well because they were one of the first makers of pesticides. And so due to its usefulness for the military, especially, which is where it started, and across many different industries and manufacturing, its use accelerated during the 1950s, the 1960s, and 70s. And today it is ubiquitous in everyday products used by people across the globe. The largest manufacturers of PFAS here in the US are DuPont and 3M. And industry documents show that these companies had proof that PFAS were highly toxic when inhaled or ingested as early as 1970, and probably a little bit before that. And that was 40 years before it was on the radar of public health officials. A little shout out I have to make right here to one of our board members and her husband, Michelle and Michael Walrath, who made the documentary film, The Devil We Know, about what the industry knew and kept secret for decades. Where is PFAS found? Most Americans are probably most familiar with Teflon nonstick cookware. But if you were putting away your winter jackets and your waterproof boots right now, You are also looking at products that use PFAS. Carpets, stain and waterproof fabrics for furniture, cars, car seats, strollers, and other baby accessories. Electronic equipment, including iPhones and computer chips. Makeup. Think about waterproof mascara and skin lotions, pesticides, and pharmaceuticals. These are just a few of the hundreds and hundreds of products lining store shelves that contain these forever chemicals. Very problematic, though, are the products used every day for food and drinks. Food packaging for takeout is a major source of PFAS exposure, especially for greasy fast foods. How many people are eating at fast food restaurants every single day? Or ordering takeout for their dinner? And try looking for a paper cup for your morning coffee that isn't lined with PFAS. This is not an easy task. Although, because we run the farmers market here in Port Washington down on Long Island, we have finally found a non-PFAS cup with a paper fiber top. And they are distributed through Good Start Packaging in New Hampshire. They have a small but growing offering of PFAS-free food containers. Mamavation is a small nonprofit who is working with some highly regarded scientists to test consumer products for the presence of PFAS in everything from toilet paper to muffin baking cups. And I'll put these two links in the chat for anyone who's interested in a little while. So why are we actually having this discussion? Well, PFAS has now been detected in the blood of over 98% of Americans. Health problems linked with PFAS exposure include certain cancers. Testicular and kidney are the most studied. Strokes, asthma, heart disease, thyroid disease, stunted development, weakened immune system, high cholesterol, obesity, diabetes, and fertility problems. PFAS are readily absorbed into our bodies through ingestion, inhalation, and to a lesser extent, skin absorption. Essentially, anything you eat or drink with PFAS contamination will get into your body and into your blood. Firefighters have a huge occupational exposure due to their use of AFFF or air film forming foam, which is used to put out fires and to train firefighters. They are also issued turnout gear, clothing, you know, the black firefighters' outfits, right? Which is heavily impregnated with PFAS. Unusually high rates of testicular cancer are found in firefighters, young and old. And this source of PFAS is one of the major contributors to PFAS in our public water supplies, of which 45% is contaminated with PFAS. Dr. Linda Birnbaum, former director of NIEHS and NTP, which is the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program, and 19 years as director of the EPA's Division on Environmental Health Research, has been studying the health effects of exposures to PFAS and the current regulations for PFAS in drinking water. In 2009, the EPA advised that 400 parts per trillion in drinking water was fine. In 2016, the EPA said that PFAS at low levels, 70 parts per trillion, were not a concern. But then a few years later, they reversed course and said that any level could cause harm, changing it to no more than 4 parts per trillion. EPA then declared that PFOA and PFOS, two common PFAS, are likely human carcinogens, so the limit would have to be 0. But the regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act requires that they do something that is technologically feasible, which at the moment is 4 parts per trillion. Many public water supplies are already installing expensive filtration systems to meet this requirement. There's some good news, and that is that 3M will pay more than $20 billion to settle 2 lawsuits surrounding forever chemicals in drinking water and pay for the cleanup. That said, the only answer is to stop producing this entire class of chemicals immediately. And then, how do you clean up an entire river system? an underground aquifer. How do you break those carbon fluorine bonds? You can incinerate them at about 1200 degrees. And at this point, I'm going to end and turn to David Bond, who knows a lot more about this than I do. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. David, I'm going to do a little intro for you as well, and then feel free to cover whatever's more relevant if I've left anything pertinent out. But thank you so much, Patty. Professor David Bond is the Associate Director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Action and a Professor of Anthropology at Bennington College. He works with communities besieged by the fossil fuel industry to develop a more transformative grasp of environmental justice for people, politics, and critical theory. One of the papers of his that I have been working my way through, which he is a co-author, is PFAS, soil and groundwater contamination via industrial airborne emission and land deposition in southwestern Vermont and eastern New York State, which was published in Environmental Science, Processes, and Impact. So thank you so much, Professor Bond, for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so delighted to share the evening with you all. I think I'll just start by underlining a few of the key points that Patti made already, but are really important to understand on this PFAS issue, and then move into a discussion of incineration and some of the emerging concerns around incineration. PFAS are a synthetic chemical. They're not found in nature. They're produced in factories, and they came into widespread circulation, as Patti noted, in the post-war sort of moment, with real densities of production in the U.S. And to a lesser extent parts of Europe. The carbon-fluorine bond that sort of defines PFAS chemicals was described to me several times as a Herculean bond, the strongest known bond in chemistry, and so on. It's almost, as already said, indestructible once it's formed. It's an incredibly strong chemical bond. These chemicals are incredibly inert. They don't react to anything. They repel water and oil, and they have an incredible thermal stability. These properties made them very useful to plastics manufacturing, and PFOA or PFOA is often associated with plastics manufacturing. You have two sort of pathways through industry. One is plastics manufacturing, and the other is firefighting foams. They have an incredible ability to extinguish jet fuel fires in seconds, and PFOS is often associated with that firefighting foam use. The same properties that made them useful have made them an unprecedented crisis of toxicity, not only in the US, but around the world. As we've said, they never break down, which has led to a number of advocates and activists to start to refer to them as forever chemicals. And that name is really stuck as an accurate description, that once they're released, they kind of never go away. The three things you kind of need to know about them are they're virtually indestructible. They're incredibly mobile once released, that they move very easily through a lot of environmental systems. They do get stuck up in organic matter in shallow soils and in human bodies, but are very mobile otherwise. These days, basically, everywhere we've looked for these chemicals, we found them. In the past few years, they've been found in penguins and in polar bears. They've been found on Mount Everest in the Mariana Trench. They've been found in rain, in snow, in soil, and in an astounding variety of consumer products. There are real densities, though, in the exposures, which is often sort of grouped around people living downstream of plastics manufacturing, downstream of military bases. And there's a new set of studies just coming out on indigenous populations in the far north. Planetary circulations seem to be concentrating a lot of these chemicals in the far north, as they did with PCBs. So there's kind of almost planetary coverage of these chemicals, despite their manufacture being pretty restricted to the U.S. And parts of Europe for most of the past 70 years. They're now found everywhere you look for them. We found them. So they're indestructible, they're mobile, and they're toxic. And not only are they toxic, they're pushing the discipline of toxicity into an entirely new metric of concern, and that's parts per trillion. That these chemicals cause harm at almost infinitely small levels of exposure. Indestructible, mobile, and toxic at new metrics of exposure that goes all the way down to parts per trillion, which was almost impossible to even measure at a few years ago. And in some ways, it's the problem of PFAS that's actually pushing the analytics into ever more granular scales of analysis. Those are the three things you need to know: indestructible, mobile, and toxic at extremely low levels of exposure. I'm at pains to emphasize in every presentation I give that the companies that manufactured and sold these chemicals were deeply aware of all three of those properties almost from the beginning of when they started to use them. 3M and DuPont, and to a lesser extent the US military, were very aware of all of the concerns of these chemicals, from clear patterns of health issues among workers who interacted with them, to clear evidence of these chemicals making their way into drinking water systems downriver of factories and military bases, to even in the late 70s, going out and trying to do a study of workers in the plants that were producing PFAS against a population of Americans that were unexposed. Guess what the problem was of that study? They couldn't find an unexposed population. Late 70s. Every time this information came to light, and it came to light with robust scientific backing within the companies, and that evidence, that data moved to the highest levels of management in those companies, and every time there was an executive decision to ignore the evidence and repress the findings. And that's a large part of the mess we're now in, is that from that extraordinary disregard for the public health. So indestructible, mobile, and toxic, and the companies that manufactured and profited immensely from them knew from the get-go that this was a different class of chemicals that posed real problems. And they manufactured them and encouraged the kind of willful disposal of them into waterways, landfills, and a whole host of other sites. That's the quick overview. I'll say one thing also just quickly, it came up earlier. I live in Bennington, Vermont. I've worked with communities in Hoosick Falls, which is 6 miles down the road, and Bennington and Petersburg, New York, that all have plastics factories in those towns. And we've had a real issue since 2015 of PFAS, extensive PFAS contamination from those factories. One of the lessons I learned in working with residents to document that and to put together a scientifically rich foundation for them to demand accountability. One of the lessons I learned is about the tactics of the PFAS industry right now. And one of the things that they've gotten very good at is to start to point out how many consumer products have PFAS in them, and then to begin to talk about how we're all kind of responsible for this issue. And so since we're all responsible, since we've all used different things that have PFAS in them, no one can really be held accountable for it. And I'll just say in my neck of the woods, we did a study that Courtney was pointing out where we tried to document, you're talking about a factory that accepted and emitted PFAS by the ton annually as being an equivalent source to trace amounts of PFAS in a waterproof coat, lipstick, or a kind of a hamburger wrapper. And now, yes, we should be concerned and aware of how ubiquitous PFAS is in consumer products, but we should never let that lead us to lose sight of the industrial fingerprints that are all over the actual crisis. Just to point that out. Incineration. I want to share a slide that I think distills the sheer absurdity of the situation we find ourselves in. So let me see if I can do this. Everybody can see this? This is an EPA. It was a preliminary report, and I protested loudly. So I think that they've started to clean it up a bit. But the lines I've highlighted were like the contradiction that we're living around incineration with PFAS. So first, the EPA says incineration is an acceptable way to try to destroy PFAS chemicals. Incomplete destruction of PFAS during combustion may lead to the formation of smaller PFAS or other kinds of nasty chemicals. All of this. Next line. The effectiveness of incineration to destroy PFAS and the tendency for formation of PICs is currently not well understood. So various iterations of this contradiction you can find in a lot of the guidance coming out of regulatory bodies around the question of incineration and PFAS, which is one, incineration is an acceptable method to dispose of PFAS chemicals. Two, we have no idea whether incineration destroys these chemicals or not. This is the mess that we're in on the question of how to dispose of these chemicals. I'm sure folks are aware. They're called forever chemicals for a reason. They were used to put out fires for a reason, because they're really good at they have an incredible thermal stability, and they can extinguish any kind of fire. There is some evidence that's mostly theoretical of the perfect conditions that should lead for incineration to actually break down these chemicals. Unfortunately, we have almost no evidence of that working in actual incinerators, hazardous waste incinerators, municipal incinerators, and others. And there is some evidence that those incinerators that are accepting delivery of PFAS are just emitting it into the surrounding neighborhoods. And we know who lives around incinerators. It's often poor and working communities of color. The notion that you can incinerate PFAS, I've talked about elsewhere, as really a way of redistributing the PFAS crisis into poor communities. I'll say a few more things, and then happy to sort of answer any questions too. We at Bennington College, we did a study right before COVID, so we had an embarrassingly small number of samples. But the Norlite hazardous waste incinerator, which is in Cohoes, New York, it's a huge hazardous waste incinerator, and it's tucked into a little neighborhood in Cohoes, New York, in the Capital District. We caught wind that DOD, which had one of the biggest stockpiles of AFFF. AFFF is the firefighting foam that's made up of PFAS chemicals. That DOD, the Department of Defense, saw that Congress was going to regulate AFFF as a hazardous waste substance, and suddenly decided it wanted to get rid of its stockpile quick. So what did it do? It started shipping it as fast as it possibly could to any incinerator that would accept it. And they explicitly said they did not want documentation of the incineration process. They did not want to know what happened. They just wanted it shoveled into incinerators as fast as was humanly possible. I wrote about this in The Guardian. There's an article I did. I can put it in the chat so folks are curious about that. And if you're also curious, you can go to www.bennington.edu/AFFF. And that has, we were able to get a hold of all of the shipping information from DOD about where they were shipping AFFF to incinerators, and tried to document that as much as we could to bring that to light, and led to a number of municipal, state, and then even a federal rule that limited DOD from burning AFFF until there was overwhelming scientific consensus that incineration was a safe and effective method of disposal. That consensus is still outstanding. So we were able to help stop the military, but there's still a lot of private operators, small firefighting departments, even state agencies, and the petrochemical industry that we believe is still trying to burn a lot of PFAS. The other thing I'll say very quickly is that we've done a few studies on airborne deposition. Those studies can be found at bennington.edu/PFOA. And you can scroll down to some of the studies, and we have a couple maps of how far these things travel when they're emitted from stacks. When we started this project, 2015, the working model, which was funded by guess who? Petrochemical industry, was that when a plant emitted PFAS chemicals, they're so heavy that they would come right back down to ground before the fence line. So all contamination would be right at the property of the plant itself. That didn't make a lot of sense to us, and we happen to be in a really good place to think about that question, because just downwind of us is the Green Mountain National Forest, which was set aside from all development in the 1930s. So that's before PFAS was ever synthesized. And we were able to sort of see, we have these 3 plastics factories that we know emitted PFAS for decades and decades. We know that the Green Mountain National Forest is just downwind, has no development, so has no other potential source of PFAS but for the emissions from those factories. And we were able to do a kind of grid study of the soil in the Green Mountain National Forest downwind, and found very elevated levels in a clear pattern that was followed the wind direction, that went out about 16 miles downwind of the factories, and was about 5 or 6 miles wide. And we estimate, about 100 square miles or so from these factories was the emissions led to elevated PFAS levels in that area. And folks can find all that information on the website bennington.edu/PFOA. And the AFFF, all of our information, we put it in a Power BI. It was our first run at Power BI, so it's a bit clunky, but it has all of the data on all of the DoD shipments of AFFF to incinerators around the U.S.
Thank you, Professor Bond. Disturbing, infuriating, and informative, as these usually are. We've already gotten a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'm gonna pose some of those, and then Patti and David, you can let me know who you think would be best to take a stab at it. So we had a question about banning PFAS. So has any country banned it? Has any company pledged to stop using it? Has there been any movement on that? Go ahead, Patti.
Patti, I think you're muted.
I can just say that there are state initiatives all over the country that are trying to ban PFAS in various types of situations. Like in Maine, for instance, they're banning the use of sewage sludge as fertilizer because it contains PFAS. Sewage sludge actually comes from municipal sewage treatment plants, and it's practically free. I mean, they're trying to get rid of it. It's a solid waste problem, right? And so let's give it to these farmers. And in fact, what has happened in Maine is that they've actually had to shut down some of these farms, including dairy farms, where they have found that the milk is contaminated with the PFAS from the cows actually grazing, on that farmland. So there is movement on the state level. On the federal level, we're just talking, I think, and David can confirm this as to what drinking water limits should be so far.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just reiterate this. I mean, on the federal level, we're playing a game of inches when the Hail Mary is needed. Like we're quibbling over like the tiniest things when we need a radical kind of sea change. Points of inspiration that we should be, I think, thinking with the EU. The EU has started to try to regulate classes of chemicals. So not individual chemical by individual chemical, but say PFAS, a family of compounds, 15,000 of them, seem to share the same toxicological profile. So instead of regulating them one by one, let's regulate them all. That's a great model for how we might face up to this. Right now, we should know the US, we regulate chemicals individual by individual. We presume chemicals are safe until proven toxic. And the burden of proof comes out to communities that are under-resourced in comparison to those who are profiting from them. This is a completely backwards regulatory system. The EU has a system that sort of presumes the chemicals are toxic until proven safe. That's another sort of way to go about it. I'll also say that with PFAS, PFOA or PFOA and PFOS are the ones the EPA is moving the furthest along with. 3M and DuPont knew about the dangers of those two chemicals in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Amassed an incredible archive of the very precise damage these chemicals were doing to their workers and to communities near their factories. The EPA only becomes aware of that in 2001. Rob Bilott, the attorney that there's been the movie about, sent a very famous letter to the EPA in 2001. You can Google it, Rob Bilott's letter to EPA 2001. It's a great resource for all of he's just sharing what he's found in the corporate archive in discovery to the EPA to let them know. 2001. Here we are, 2024. Where are we? EPA's had all of the information the corporations knew about the chemicals they were producing that they knew in the 60s and 70s. 2024, where are we? The EPA has an interim rule about how it might want to make an enforceable standard for PFOA and PFOS. There are 4 other PFAS chemicals that the EPA is also beginning to move on. But if that's the amount of time it takes to go from becoming aware of the dangers to actually issuing regulations that protect us, we're never going to get through the entire class of PFAS chemicals. I'll say one final point is that, to me, this is really depressing, and it sort of points out the real failures of our regulatory system, but it's also an opportunity for us to demand a regulatory system that's adequate to the actual challenges we have with PFAS.
Thank you, David. There was another question from John Rath. Is New York State DEC recognizing the PFAS issues from incinerators yet?
This is
No.
they're aware of the issues. I'll say that. I've had several meetings with them with Norlight. They are very aware of the issues. They have not, in my opinion, issued a strong stance on it. When we were doing trying to have a ban on burning AFFF in municipalities and in the state of New York, there was some real hesitation from that agency about passing those rules.
Mhm. Yeah, I just want to share an anecdote. I went on a tour of the Wheelabrator trash incinerator a few years ago now, and they had one of their environmental PR people come talk to us. And our group that included some municipal officials, the Peekskill NAACP, the Conservation Advisory Council, other environmental orgs. We didn't bring up PFAS, but their person brought up PFAS. And she shared the amazing news with us that incineration renders PFAS inert. And I thought, wow, that's like, where's your Nobel Prize? And so I asked some more questions, and I was like, well, what do you mean by inert? And after some pressure and digging and questions, it turned out that their definition, so I think the layperson, or even myself as a scientist, my definition of inert is like, that's it, it's done, it has no biological activity or chemical activity anymore. Their definition, which I think is important for people to understand the ways in which they manipulate language to greenwash things, was their definition of inert is that when it is only and when it is caught in the stack and it is captured along with the ash and the other air pollutants using their emissions control machinery in the smokestack, when it is captured there and incorporated into the ash, if they model the erosion that ash would encounter in the landfill and the release of PFAS from the ash does not exceed EPA limits, that is their definition of inert. And we have already said these limits are not based on health and safety, right? They're based on feasibility or cost, et cetera. They're legal limits. They're not health and safety limits. And so they go around telling us all that it renders PFAS inert, but they use this special, their own personal definition of inert. And also they make it seem like they capture all of the PFAS. They don't, right? So whatever they happen to get in their emission controls, which are not meant or designed to capture PFAS, that will fit their special definition of inert. But then there's everything else that gets released. So I think it's really important for all of us here in Westchester to realize this is what wind waste is telling our decision makers. That's what they're telling Department of Environmental Facilities. It's what they're telling our county executive, and it's patently false. But if our decision makers are not healthily skeptical and sufficiently educated on this, they'll buy it. And that is, I think, why we have had an incinerator spewing this stuff for 40 years in an environmental justice community. Go ahead, David.
I'll just thank you for that. It's super important points to be made about how easily a kind of, very confident engineering talk can get associated with this. But as of now, there's no evidence that incineration breaks down AFFF in any meaningful way. And I'll just point out, I put my Guardian piece on this in the chat, and there's a lot of links in that short piece to all of the places that various federal agencies or other groups are talking about how little is known about incineration and AFFF. So if folks want to sort of see and document, see the primary sources of where they're acknowledging how little is known, they're in the links.
Thank you. Peter Close had an important question. He says, are you familiar with air deposition of PFAS from burn pits managed by Air National Guard units who did decades of firefighting training with AFFF? And are you familiar with PFAS contamination of the Kensico Reservoir from runoff and airborne deposition? so Kensico Reservoir is part of New York City's watershed. I mean, this whole area is all part of New York City watershed. So do you have any answers to that, Patti or David?
You know, David is probably more familiar with this, but I know that the airport, the Westchester Airport, is a factor in that, for sure. This is going back years when they were talking about this. You know, I'd like to, you know, ask Ellen, who is also on the call here. She probably has been in, you know, 40 meetings about the PFAS and the use of it as you know, for the foam at the airports, use of it in foam. But David, you may know more about what's going on with the reservoir contamination.
I don't know about that specific issue. I do know that there's a lot of concern now about all of the kinds of burn pits and incineration that the military uses, not only in the US, but worldwide, as also being linked up to potential PFAS releases. So I know that question is being asked. I haven't seen anyone answering that question yet. In a way that I've seen. I will note that I think I sense, this is my own opinion, I'm just going out and telling you my opinion, that New York State DEC, when PFAS was first kind of coming into focus in 2016, 17, 18, did try to get out and start to do a lot of sampling, but very quickly, I think, realized everywhere they sample for these chemicals, they're going to find them.
Right.
And then it becomes a real hesitation of not wanting to sample in places you don't know who to hold accountable and who to sue to pay for the filtration systems that people will then demand. And it's my own opinion, but I get a sense that DEC is starting to back off sampling a little bit because they don't want to know how bad it is before there's a kind of solution in place of how to bring filtration systems to people who are being exposed to these chemicals.
You know, I would just like to make a comment here. It's a little bit, it goes a little bit off topic here, but filtering PFAS out of your water can be done with reverse osmosis systems, right? Here on Long Island, we have a PFAS problem in our water supply, which is underground aquifers. And what we're also finding out now through new technology that was developed at Columbia University and Rutgers, when they were looking for nanoparticles of plastic, right? Plastic nanoparticles, and they were finding them just very easily in all water sources that they tested. When I say sources, I mean, you know, consumer water sources like bottles of water and so on, and tap water. And what they also found that the nanoplastics were also coming from the reverse osmosis systems themselves, because reverse osmosis is using plastic filtration, you know, components. And so so this kind of makes it a little bit difficult, I think, for the consumer at least, to try to find a way to remove PFAS and not at the same time get nanoplastics in that water from the filtration process.
Thank you, Patti. I think I'm gonna do a moderator's prerogative and ask a question myself as our last question before we move to our action items. And I think I might know the answer, but I'd like to hear from you both, given your expertise. So for Peekskill in particular, you know, we're on the shore of the Hudson River, the nation's largest Superfund site contaminated with PCBs. We've got folks who subsistence fish. From there, we have the trash incinerator. We have Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant. We have the Algonquin fracked gas transmission pipeline. We have a sewage treatment plant. We have a BASF chemical factory that makes paint additives. All of that in this community. And Wheelabrator's favorite thing to do is say, well, we're not the only source of air pollution in Peekskill. And so my questions are, what are the cumulative impacts to a community like Peekskill that is facing all of these different kinds of air pollutants on or sources of pollution, potentially water, soil, we know it's air pollution, plus heat island effect and other things from being in a city. Like, what are the cumulative impacts of this? And is it correct to say that taking the incinerator out of the mix will help us? Because they like to imply that, like, until we close every other source of air pollution in Peekskill, they can keep producing air pollution.
Well, that's an interesting question. I always think of the Hudson River, it is an estuary, right? So that it actually flows north and south according to the tides in the Atlantic Ocean. So that whatever the pollution is that is occurring in Peekskill, in the water, at least in the Hudson River, is moving. All the way down to Manhattan and all the way up to Troy, which is as far as that estuary effect is taking place there. So that's one thing, is that whatever pollution is being generated there is moving, and doesn't mean that it's going away, right? But it's being spread around from a water perspective. But David, you probably know more, obviously, about air contaminants and I do know about the pipelines, because we've been very involved in the Algonquin pipeline, which is so close to the nuclear power plant, which is at the present being decommissioned by a company that is not so great. Okay, David, take it away.
I mean, it's clear there's a lot of malicious synergies that happen when all of these different industries interact in this way. And that where people live, often, the air that people breathe does not mark off all of these separate things as separate exposures. And this is an issue I think we have to center, is how people experience environmental injustice. That we don't experience these kinds of injustices by, this day we're going to have the incinerator. This day we're going to experience this day. Like, we experience it all together, and that needs to be part of the conversation. This very similar thing happened when we were working on Norlight. The DEC sort of was saying, basically, like, we can't even tell, who contributed what. So how do you? It's impossible to actually investigate this site because it's too mixed up. And I thought, this is an absurd starting point for a federal agency, like, or a state agency. Like, we need to be centering people and people's health and what's necessary to ensure the health of our communities, and start from there. And that's unfortunately something that a lot of agencies need to be reminded of fairly consistently.
And I just want to say one other thing is that, the synergistic effect of some of these different chemicals that are coming off these different sources could really, be playing a role in the health of the community in a really significant way. And at least that should be studied. Somebody should understand which chemicals and which exposures are happening, and, what the synergistic effect is of those chemicals. And it's a difficult situation. And so you're going to have to gather people like David, who can come in and talk to people who are, in control, right, in these local municipalities. And it's their job to protect their constituents.
Thanks, Patti. We're going to do that right now. So now to our action items. So we always try to include those, because learning about it's not enough. We've got to make the change. So one thing we're going to do, one of our action items tonight, and I will email this information out later, and Caitlin will drop links in the chat. So this is with Beyond Plastics, of which Patti is on the board, and David, I believe, has also worked with Beyond Plastics because they're at Bennington as well. So the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act, last month we had Senator Harcum come and join us to discuss that. We still need it passed, and we as constituents can make that happen. So this legislation is really important because it would get rid of the plastics. It would like just stop making them. We're not going to recycle our way out of it. Burning it is releasing the PFAS. We're not going to, so just stop making it, and to ban the chemical additives like we've been talking about tonight out of those plastics. So this is really getting at the root of the problem and not the whack-a-mole of closing each incinerator, just to get at the root of the problem, stop making the plastics. The goal is to get this passed before Earth Day, but we need to get our elected, particularly our elected officials in Albany to pass it. So if you click on that link, it sends you right to a page with the phone number, the call-in script, and you can literally just read it aloud. And if you really don't want to talk to a staffer, you can call as soon as you hang up from this meeting and get their voicemail. And then you leave it, they still register your call, but you don't have to talk to a person. So you keep that link open in your browser. And when we're done with this call tonight, you can make those phone calls, or you can call tomorrow. You can call multiple times, especially like if Andrea Stewart-Cousins is your senator, like your calls as her constituent are really important. So this is going to, you know, for folks who are like, what can we do to address this? This is one thing we can do. The other thing we're going to do is to email our county executive, and Caitlin will drop a link to a sample email that you are welcome to use as a starting point for your email. We're going to email the county executive. We're going to email some key people in the Department of Environmental Facilities, the Office of Sustainability, and key Board of Ledge members who are chair of relevant committees. And we're going to drive home again about this zero waste study and the need to make it count. And given the disturbing information we've learned tonight, I encourage you to add a paragraph in there about what you've learned and about another reason for why we need to close down this incinerator and move to zero waste, because we are contributing another harm to our community. And really that RFP didn't fully take into account, I don't think, the health emergency that Peekskill residents are facing. So our two items, one is the legislation in Albany, two is a letter, an email to the county executive. And you can just copy paste, but definitely feel free to put your own spin on it and personalize it so they understand why this is important to you and why they need to act on it. And so with that, we've got some upcoming events because Earth Day is happening in April, super busy. We would like to do even more, but we need people. We need volunteers to help with the tabling. We have all the materials, and we can even pair you up and make sure you're with one of our WAS core volunteers, so you don't need to be the person who knows the answer to every question. But the more folks we have, the more of these kinds of events we can attend. Or if you're already tabling at an event, we can provide you with materials. So email us at the waspeakskill@gmail.com. Let us know if you're able to volunteer and or if you need more materials. And next month's Zero Waste Task Force, we're going to focus, because it's like getting ready for budget time in Albany. We're going to be bringing in some speakers who are familiar with what's happening up there and what ways we can influence what's happening in Albany to move our state towards zero waste. So with that, I would just like to again thank our speakers for sharing their expertise on this critical issue, and for all of you for coming and for keeping on with this effort, because, you know, we really can. This waste system was set up by our county government for us. We can, just as they assembled it, we can disassemble it and make a just system that isn't harming our planet and our people. So with that, thank you so much for coming, everyone. And I will send out the link to the recording and the materials and the action items, and look forward to seeing you next month. So thank you all.